Way.
There's peeps.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Oh, I can see some faces this time. Yay. It's exciting. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Laura and I work in production here at the Mill. You might have also seen me at shows, on vlogs, all sorts of places. And this afternoon, I have the pleasure of hosting Becks with, and now correct me if I get this wrong, Becks, practical tips for perfecting plying?
Something like that.
Plying stuff.
Flying stuff.
Right, so I think we've pretty much got everyone in. There'll be a few people just joining as we go, as standard. But yeah, just generally welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to see lots of faces, lots of familiar faces, lots of new faces, and people who can't be with us in person. So it's really great that we can see you through the screen. And without further ado, hopefully on everyone's screen we can see Becks from Tiny Fibre Studio. Becks also does a little bit of work for us, some filming, some website work. She's a bit of a technical wizard as well as a spinning wizard, really knows her stuff. So I'll hand over to Becks. She'll tell us what she's going to tell us, and we'll watch in amazement as you show us what we can do with our spinning.
Fingers crossed. Amazing. There we go. I was going to say I was still little in the corner. I was like, I'm fine with being little in the corner, but people might want to see it bigger. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming along, everybody. This is it's always just a real treat to have everybody from all over the world joining us. And today we are going to be talking a little bit about plying, and specifically kind of really fine-tuning your plying. So I know that we're probably going to have a lot of people at different skill levels, so there's just some sort of terms that I want to go through, just so that we're all kind of on the same page. First of all, just in case you're all completely new to it, plying is when you spin two singles yarns, so individual strands of yarn. You've spun those in one direction, and then you take two or more of them and you spin them back on each other in the opposite direction. So that's plying. What do I mean by perfecting your plying? Well, obviously plying is a skill that we learn fairly early in our spinning, so I'm definitely not here to teach people things that they already know, but there are a lot of different skill levels, and so there might be some things that we come across that you might think, oh, I already knew that, but hopefully there will be something for everybody that maybe just makes you think a little bit differently about the way that you ply. There might be some things that you think, well, my way of plying works better for me, and that's also totally fine. We've all got our own experiences, and you know, if it works for you, that's great. Keep using it. But yeah, hopefully there'll be some things that will inspire you to have a little bit of a think and maybe try out some different techniques as well. And when I say perfect your plying, one of the things that's really joyful about handspun yarn is that it's not perfect, because if we wanted perfect yarn, then we would buy some that was already spun. Funnily enough, there are mills that make that kind of thing, apparently. But I know that when I first started spinning, I was putting quite a lot of effort into my singles, and I was really trying to get my singles to be really consistent. And then when it came to plying, I just kind of flung it vaguely in the direction of the wheel and hope for the best. And at some point I came to the realization that it was feeling like a little bit of an afterthought, and I realized that maybe I wasn't doing my singles justice, just throwing it at the wheel. So now if I'm going to put the effort into spinning a yarn, I also want to be just as purposeful about the plying as I am about the spinning. Another term that we'll come across as we go through this session is we'll probably talk about Z and S twist. So again, I just want to make sure that we all know what that is. So when we spin on a wheel or a spindle, the direction that it's turning in determines which type of twist or which direction of twist is being added. So if you're spinning clockwise, you're adding Z twist. If you're spinning anti-clockwise or counterclockwise, you're adding S twist. Most people learn to spin the singles Z and ply S, but it really doesn't matter as long as you ply in the opposite direction to the way that you spun the singles, and as long as it suits your project, but we might come on to that later. If you struggle to remember which is which, because I still mentally have to think about this, if you struggle to remember, the easiest way that I've found to remember it is just to start drawing the letter in the air with your finger. And whichever direction your finger goes first is the direction that the wheel or spindle needs to go to add that type of twist. So I have to mentally picture that sometimes when I'm trying to think about which direction my twist was going in. Twist also leaves a mark on your yarn, so even if you can't remember which way your wheel or spindle was going, you can find out. So by looking at the line of twist in either a single or applied yarn, it's a lot easier on applied yarn, but you can sometimes see it in a single, you can tell which way the last lot of twist was inserted. And the easiest way to remember this is to think about which way the bar in the middle of the letter goes. So if you think about a Z, the bar in the middle goes from the top right to the bottom left, and it's vice versa for an S twist. So that's how to read the twist direction. Fun little fact, or maybe a challenge. If you use an Apple device, have a really close look at the yarn emoji sometime, because there's something interesting going on with the Z and S twist in that emoji. Clearly I don't get out enough, but I noticed one day and went, huh, interesting. And by the way, as we go through this, please do feel free to pop any questions or comments in the chat, because I've got the chat open, I can kind of see as we go along, but also if I miss something, Laura can feed some questions to me. So we could just leave our yarn as a single. We don't have to ply it necessarily, but there are some reasons why we might want to think about doing that. The first one is strength. So both in terms of tensile strength. So if I took a singles and I tried to pull on it and break it, this would be a lot less strong than applied yarn. But also from the point of view of durability. So if I were to make a garment in a singles yarn, it would start to rub and start to pill a lot more easily than something that was made from plied yarn. And it's just because those plies kind of cozy up next to each other and protect each other from the wear around them. Using multiple singles also means that you've got the best possible chance of evening out any inconsistencies in your singles. Because try as we might, I can pretty much guarantee that for most people, the yarn that you start to spin at the beginning of a project is probably not the same as what it is when you get towards the end. Usually one of two things happens. Either you're really excited to get it finished, and so you start rushing it a little bit and it starts getting maybe finer or maybe thicker. Either that, or you get bored of the project and you're just, especially if it's something fairly plain, you get bored of the project and you just want it over and done with. So the chances are it's going to be slightly different. And if you're plying multiple yarns together, then you're sort of taking the best and the not so desirable, I don't want to say worst, but you're taking the good and the bad and you're sort of blending them together, so it'll come out a lot more consistent. There's also a ton of design possibilities with plied yarns, because you can do all sorts of different things with colour. You can have, you know, barber poled colours where you've got one single that's one colour, one single that's another. They make really interesting little interactions as they go together. You can do things like cabled yarns. I'm really into cabled yarns at the moment. They're very fun. We might talk about those a bit later. Crepe yarns, where you have one plied yarn and then you ply it back with another single. You can do gradients with chain plies. You can do all sorts of things. There's a lot of different possibilities, and we'll also talk a bit about art yarns as we go through. Saw a note in the chat, what's a cabled or crepe yarn? So a cabled yarn is where you take two plied yarns and you ply them back on each other. And we'll look at an example later on. It kind of comes up, it's called a cabled yarn. I think it looks like a chain, which then gets really confusing because you also have chain ply, that's a whole other thing. But a chain ply is the same as Navajo plying is a term that you might hear around. It's not technically anything to do with Navajo or Dene people in the way that they ply yarns. But yeah, chain ply and Navajo ply are the same thing. A cabled yarn is two or more plies, and you're plying them back on each other. So the next thing that I want to mention here is to do with balance. So if you have a singles yarn and you put that into a project, it doesn't always do what you would expect. There is energy in that singles, and so when you go to create a fabric with it, it can skew in different directions. It's not always the case, because it does depend on what the fabric is. So it doesn't show as much in weaving, for example, but in a stockinette swatch like we've got here, you can definitely see that it's biasing. It's kind of skewing off, and it's showing the direction that the twist originally went in. So this was a singles yarn that was spun in the Z or clockwise direction, and it's showing that in the swatch there. Again, this is quite variable because it will depend on how much singles twist is in there. I've actually got a swatch that I did recently that doesn't look like there's any skewing there or any biasing at all. And that's just because there was less twist in it. But if you do have a lot of energy in your singles, this is the kind of thing that can happen when you knit with it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There are actually knitting designs where the designers have deliberately played with energized singles, and they're really fun, and you can get it to do all kinds of interesting textural stuff. But if that's not what you want, then plying will help to balance that yarn, and essentially one lot of twist is going to cancel out the other kind of twist. So question in the chat, would a single be okay for socks? So because of the durability, it probably wouldn't be my first choice, because that single is likely to get abraded quite quickly. If you're particularly interested in looking at different yarn structures for socks, there's a couple of things that I would recommend. The Spinner's Book of Yarn Designs, which for some reason is not on my bookshelf right now and should be. Spinner's Book of Yarn Designs has some experiments, and also the sock issue of Ply magazine has a really good comparison of different structures and their durability when it comes to socks. So there's no reason why you couldn't knit socks from a single, but they would probably felt and abrade a little bit more quickly than a plied yarn would. So I hope that helps. And then the other reason we might want to ply is to consider how suitable a particular ply structure might be for the project. So this actually plays perfectly into last question. So we might want to consider, you know, how durable do we want this yarn to be? But also what kind of design features are going to be in it? For example, a 2-ply lace, if you look at the swatch on the left, the lace holes look a lot more open than they do in the swatch on the right, which is a 3-ply. The 2-ply, the sort of structure of a 2-ply lends itself very well to holding some space open, whereas the 3-ply tends to kind of almost collapse in on itself. But if we were doing a cabled sweater, for example, the cable on that 3-ply really pops a lot more. And I think hopefully you can see it. The difference in real life is really obvious, but these were taken in the same lighting conditions. And I think you can see that that 3-ply cable just kind of pops out quite a lot more. So there are some considerations there in terms of what kind of ply you might want to do. So I know this is a plying workshop, but it's kind of impossible to talk about plying without also talking about singles, especially if your goal is to produce a consistent plied yarn. The background that you'll see here, we've got a mixture of consistent singles, consistent plying techniques, but also, as it turns out, if you're looking for consistency in your plied yarns, the mistakes that you might make when plying are also actually really good foundational techniques for art yarns as well. So some of the things that I'm going to tell you about in terms of little tweaks that you can make to your plying process can actually work in the reverse for doing art yarns. So we'll come through all of these different samples and I'll tell you all about those. So a couple of questions in the chat. Plying for crochet or knitting, we will come back to that one because that is a really good question, but I also have to explain a whole load about twist, and that'll come a little bit later in the session, but hold that thought because it's a great one. Best yarn for socks, that's a whole other session, but generally I would say 3-ply, traditional 3-ply rather than chain ply and above is good, but there's also a lot of choice in terms of the actual fibre that you're using. So things like the South Down or down breeds can be really, really good for socks. They're kind of naturally resistant to felting. But yeah, whole other session. Definitely check out Ply Magazine sock issue and Spinner's Book of Yarn Designs for lots more information on those. Thank you for the questions. So when it comes to consistency in terms of the diameter of your singles, the reason that this matters is that twist will always gravitate to the thinnest parts of the yarn, both in terms of the single and also in the plying. So I've done a really extreme example here. This looks ridiculous in real life, but because we're on the internet and you need to be able to see this clearly, I've gone for a really extreme example. So you can see that the amount of twist in the top half is completely different to the amount of twist in the bottom half. You've got something like, I think, 5 twists in that top half and 2-ish at the bottom. And that's because all of that twist has just gravitated to the thinner section of the yarn. And you'll also notice that particularly in the white one on the left, there's barely any twist in there at all. So any of the singles twist that was there in the first place has been completely taken out. So that would just be a really weak point in the yarn. So trying to work on your singles consistency is always a great thing to try. We're human, we're not going to produce perfectly even singles, but it can be a good challenge to try and get as consistent as you can. A couple of tips for that are to think about trying to draft out the exact same amount of fibre every time you press the treadle. Or if you're on an electric wheel, obviously you don't have a treadle to press, so it's a lot harder to do that. but you could consider using something like a metronome, or you can download a metronome app to help try and keep yourself on track with how much you're drafting out at a time. However, I mentioned earlier that art yarns can come quite nicely from mistakes in yarn, and deliberately thick or thin yarn is actually a great foundation for art yarns like flame yarns and beehives. So if you struggle with the consistency of thickness in your singles, you can try and learn to do thick and thin, and then that becomes the foundation for an art yarn. Read the plying. What is the difference between combed and worsted fibres, or worsted fibres if you're in mill spinning, and what's suitable for different projects? For example, a cabled sweater. So woolen versus worsted, again, is kind of a whole subject in and of itself. Essentially, combed fibres tend to go into a worsted yarn, not always. So worsted tends to produce a smoother, more kind of sleek yarn with a bit more drape, whereas a woolen spun yarn will tend to produce something that's got a little bit more of a sort of bloom to it. It's a little bit more kind of fuzzy, and so your stitches might not be as distinct. And it's also, it tends to be a little bit less durable, but the upside is that it's super warm because it traps lots and lots of air in those carded fibres that would go into a woolen spun yarn. So it's a brief answer, but it is a whole subject in and of itself. So, and sadly, we only have an hour, so it'd be great to answer all of these, but I'm sure we'll jot them down for ideas for future workshops. So yeah, that's all around singles. Let's talk about I'll switch over to B camera, and I'll tell you about some of the things that I tend to do when I'm spinning to try to make my singles more consistent. And I'm actually just going to put something across my lap just so that you can see this a little bit more clearly. So I've just spun this single. I actually spun it while we were doing the introduction to the open weekend. And what I like to do is to take a ply back test as a rough guesstimate of how I'm doing with my singles. There are a couple of ways you can do this. So you can just fold a piece of yarn back on itself and then just allow it to twist back together. Or what I like to do is to use my orifice hook. This is one of the old design shacked ones that I kind of wish they would bring back because they were much better for plyback tests. And you can use it almost like a spindle and it'll twist back on itself. And the reason that I tend to use the orifice hook is that if I just want to do a quick plyback test and then undo it again and continue spinning rather than breaking it off, the orifice hook just makes it a lot easier to remove all the twist and continue spinning. Whereas sometimes if you just fold it back on itself, you might sort of struggle when you get down to the bottom. It kind of wants to cling back to itself, which is a little bit annoying. You don't only have to do a 2-ply back test. You can do more than one fold. So if I wanted to see how this would look as a 3-ply, I could just fold it once and then fold it again. So I've now got 3 strands there. And again, I could just let those twist back on themselves. And it will give me an idea of how that's going to look as a 3-ply yarn. And if I wanted to use the orifice hook for that, the trick is to, this time, instead of putting it in the middle of that first fold, you can put it at the end. And again, just kind of hitch it where your next fold is going to be. Take another section and then let the orifice hook act as a spindle. And you can keep doing that. So it doesn't just have to be 2 or 3 plies. You could keep going if you wanted to, if you want to sort of test out how that was going to look. And what I then do is I have a little planner here, which is where I keep all of my plyback samples for different projects that I'm working on. So I keep them inside here. And in this case, I did quite a few different samples of, this was one of the special tops from earlier this year. I number them, and then I have notes about the information that relates to that sample. So I'll write down things like which wheel I was spinning on, or if it was an electric spinner, I would write down what my revolutions per minute are, because my wheel tells me that stuff. And things like wraps per inch, bumps per inch, twist angle, lots of other things. I have a series on YouTube that I'm kind of partway through. My series on YouTube always take a while, but that goes through a lot of different measurements. So that's what I do with them, and then it just makes it really easy to refer back and see what I was spinning and see whether what I'm currently spinning matches what I was intending to spin. So I definitely think keeping records is a really great thing to do, because you just never know when you might want to replicate that yarn, and it can be a little bit tricky if you don't know what you were doing with it. A couple of other things that you might find helpful. When we're plying, I hear a lot of people talking about cameras reversed. Yes, the image is reversed at the moment. It shouldn't be reversed when we get to plying, but apologies, that might be a little confusing. We want to make the most of our fibre. We don't want to have too much in the way of leftovers, but equally, I'm not particularly obsessed with using every single thing, every single millimetre of yarn on my bobbin. So to get a ballpark figure, if I wanted to do a 2-ply, I've got my piece of tops here, and I will just fold it in half and then break it at the point that was in the middle. And I know that roughly that's going to give me the same amount, or I could fold it into 3. The other option is to, obviously 3 if you were doing a 3-ply, 4 if you were doing a 4-ply, and so on. Or you could weigh it if you wanted to get a little bit more specific. So that's how I divide up my fibre, just to make sure that I'm not going to end up with absolutely loads on one bobbin and none on another. We'll do a little example of what happens when I run out of yarn later. The other thing that I try to do for the sake of consistency is to build a fairly tidy bobbin. And I do that just by moving the yarn along the hooks fairly frequently. I do get sidetracked, like everybody does, and sometimes forget and end up with a big chunk of singles on the bobbin. And that's fine. It just means that sometimes when you're plying, that can kind of collapse in on the other fibres, and it can just break your flow a little bit when you're doing your plying. And the other thing is that we'll talk a little bit more about lazy Kates later, but the ideal scenario would be to have quite a long distance between where I'm sitting and where my lazy Kate is. And the reason for that, let me just pop these fibres up there. The reason for that is that twist has an opportunity to redistribute itself when you do that. So if you put lots and lots of twist into one little section of yarn and not very much in a later section of yarn, you can give it a lot of distance and it will allow it to redistribute. We'll come on to later Kates in just a second, almost there. The reason that I can't do that is because my lazy Kate is usually here, which is maybe about 10 centimeters from my hand. So what I will sometimes do is to rewind my yarn, and I have a whole video about this, so I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail right now. But rewinding your yarn also has a lot of different benefits, one of which is helping that twist to redistribute if necessary. Another option is that you can rewind onto some other kind of storage device. So you can use things like toilet roll tubes or weaving bobbins or all sorts of other things to rewind onto. And what I've done in the past is if I've had a very big project, like a sweater spin that's taken me several months to get completed, you can actually split it up amongst different bobbins so that you could, for example, ply the oldest singles with the newest singles. And that helps my consistency, at least in my experience. So that's something that's worth trying out. So we had a question about what is a lazy Kate. So the lazy Kate is what holds your bobbins when you're plying. And you can buy all sorts of different commercial ones. I'll show you one of those in a second, but you can also just make one from a box. And this one's just using some chopsticks stuck through the box. A little tip for this is it's very useful if your lazy Kate has some kind of tensioning device. And by tension, what I mean is some kind of resistance on the bobbin so that when you pull on your singles, it doesn't just go spiraling out of control and all get tangled up on itself. So if you're making one, what you can do is this one has the, I don't know how well this shows up on camera. These are kind of at an angle. So you can see this one is higher up than this one. And it means that the end of the bobbin kind of slants down a little bit. And it just means that the end of the bobbin rubs against the bottom of the box. And it just gives it that little bit of extra friction that stops it from just spooling out of control. There are a lot of different styles and types of lazy Kate. Again, we don't have time to go into all of them. You can get ones that have kind of upright vertical shafts, and that is where I'm going to put my bobbins. So then take this one off the wheel while I talk about other lazy Kates. I think the most important thing is to think about where you're going to be sitting in relation to where your lazy Kate can go, because there are some that just work a little bit better if they're right underneath where your backhand is. There are others that work better when they're right behind you. There's all sorts of different styles, but really think about where you're going to be sitting when you do your plying. Hunting around for the bobbin that was right behind me. So we've got our yarn on the bobbin, on the lazy Kate rather, and I'm going to show you how I ply. So you get this lovely top-down view. and I'll switch over in a second to the other view so that you can see what's happening on the wheel. So I've got my 2 singles yarns, and I'm going to just join these to the bobbin. You can just tie them onto your leader. So if I just show you the wheel view. So I can just tie these on. Whatever your preference is, really. Some people prefer tying them on, some people prefer to just kind of anchor the singles in there. And I'm going to just start it off with a little bit of twist, just to get it going. So the way that I do it is my backhand never moves. I'm going to put the yarn in between my thumb and my index finger, and then the second single is going to go between my index and my middle finger, and this hand is just going to stay here. I'm going to put some opposite twist in, so I'm now going anti-clockwise, so that's the S direction. And the way that I try and keep it consistent is by going almost all the way to the orifice and all the way back. So I'm pinching and pulling forward and coming all the way back to my hands. But my backhand doesn't move. And that way I know that I can measure the same distance every time. What I used to do was something like this. And all sorts of fun things happen then. So that's the way that I find easiest. Some people having some picture issues, but yeah, I think it's just going to vary depending on your internet connection. It seems like it's okay for some people.
Yeah, it's always hard to see the very detail on these spinning things.
Yeah, it's the tricky thing with trying to get this camera set up was how do you show both the lazy Kate and your hands and the wheel at the same time. And yeah. I've actually got the camera is sort of hanging over my head, clamped to my bookcase. So really hoping that that clamp holds up.
That's cool. That's when I've only plied very few times, and I thought I was doing it wrong when I did it like this. I thought, oh no, this must be wrong. So it's really cool to see that. We had a question because obviously you've just used something there that you've literally just spun just now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would you normally rest your singles for a bit longer than that?
Usually yes, and the reason is you probably won't be able to see this on the camera.
Yeah,
see it there. I'm getting lots of energy there. It really wants to twist back on itself.
Yeah, it's lively, isn't it?
It's really quite lively. It doesn't take long. Even just resting it overnight will help. But yeah, usually I would rest them for a little while. But ultimately, one of them is always going to have slightly more twists than the other. Because if I finished spinning one singles 2 days ago and then I've done one today, even if I rested it overnight, one's still going to be a bit more lively than the other. Yeah. But yeah, I just try and avoid fighting that sort of really active twist. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just bring this cloth back over so if we can make that show up a bit better for you. There we go. So I've now got to the end of my bobbin on one of the singles. but I've still got a little bit left on here that I don't want to waste. There's a lot of different ways to get around this. I use a plying bracelet. You might have heard it referred to as Andean plying. Again, it is one of those terms that doesn't actually have anything to do with the people of the Andes and how they ply yarn. Again, I have a video that talks about Andean plying and plying bracelets, so you can go and look at that. But what I'm doing is bringing the yarn up and over my middle finger, down to my thumb, around the back, and then up and over my middle finger again. And I'm just repeating that process. I won't even try to to show that closer on camera, because the video definitely has a nice detailed shot of it, and also multiple different ways to do plying bracelets. So when I've reached the end of that, I can slip the plying bracelet off my thumb. You can see how lively this is just by how much twist there is in there. And then I can take my leader off this other single, grab the end of the yarn, and just kind of sandwich it in between the two original singles. And just start plying again. And basically, when you get to the end of this, you're essentially just folding the yarn back on itself. So you've just got a little fold at the end there. And that's what's on.
Wow, that's going to save lots of people, lots of little ends. They thought, oh, got this little bit left that I can't do anything with. I'll be using that. Thanks, Becks.
Yeah. If you're doing things like a 3-ply, ultimately you will still end up with a little bit left over. But I just ply that back on itself and then use it for things like leaders or for tying up skeins of yarn.
Yeah.
Nothing really gets wasted. So as I'm doing that plying, I'm trying to make sure that the tension on the yarns is the same. What can happen is that if you've got more tension, so if you're sort of inadvertently pulling more on one yarn than the other, then you actually start getting one yarn spiraling around the other. And that's what's happened here. And you might actually be able to see that the yarn that's sort of in the middle, that's the white one that's got the dark yarn spiraling around it. Again, there's barely any twist in there because the one that has more tension gets the twist taken out more quickly. But again, that can be the basis for some really fun art yarns. So you can actually play around with this and deliberately have more tension on one yarn than the other. And that's a foundation technique for things like bullion yarns, which is kind of similar to the one on the right, but also things like boucle. And then just as an example, we talked about cabled yarns earlier on. This is a cabled yarn. So that's where you ply 2 or more 2-plies together. So you're having to flick directions each time. So you'd ply 2 yarns the same as we did here. So in the S direction, you would put more twist into them than you would for a normal balanced yarn. And I actually find it easier to just ply it normally first and then put it back through the wheel in the same direction to build up some extra twist. Do that with both of your 2-ply yarns and then ply them back on each other. Somebody mentioned crochet yarns earlier on, and I have a really geeky interest in twist and what happens to twist at various different parts of the process. So there is something called a side delivery package and an end delivery package. I don't know whether those are the terms that you use in the mill, Laura, but in the mill, if you watch the mill tour video, you'll see that there are two different types of packages, or actually three different types of packages that the yarn goes to. It goes onto bobbins, but it also goes onto tubes, or they're sometimes called cops, and it goes onto cones as well. Let me just explain the little example. So this is a very high-tech prop, toilet roll, piece of ribbon wrapped around it. If I pull it off like this, off the side, it's completely flat. If I pull it off from the front or from the top, it's getting twists put in it. And that's what happens when you pull from a centre pull ball, for example. Some people love plying from centre pull balls. It makes me really nervous because one half of the yarn is going to unwind in one direction. One half of the yarn is going to unwind in the other direction. So you've got opposite directions of twist being added. Not only that, but the one that's in the middle is going to add twist quicker than the one that's on the outside. Personally, I'm not a fan of plying from centre pull balls. If it works for you, that's great. But I do like to encourage people to think about what's happening to the twist. And there's a great question in the chat. Does this happen with the plying bracelet? Interestingly, no, because with the plying bracelet, you're actually making a flat loop. Again, sorry to keep referring you to the video, but we only have so much time here. In the plying bracelets video, I actually take one apart so that you can see what's happening with it. And it doesn't, or at least not anywhere near to the same extent as it does with a centre pull ball. But the reason that this relates to crochet is the general sort of received wisdom is when you knit, you wrap your yarn around the needle in one direction. Whereas when you crochet, you wrap your yarn around the needle in the other direction. If you've ever done a knitted long tail cast on, you might have noticed that one of your ends turns out getting very, very twisted up, and the other one seems to lose twist. And that's because when you're doing that long tail cast on, one of them is wrapping one way around the needle, the other one is wrapping the other way around the needle. So one is gaining twist, the other one is losing twist. And it's kind of like a little microcosm of what happens in knitting versus what happens in crochet. So theoretically, if you were planning to crochet with your yarn, you might choose to do the opposite of what you would normally do for a knitting yarn. Somebody mentioned, yeah, it can vary between English or continental style. I knit continental, but the same rule still applies for me with English. So there's all sorts of different ways that people knit, but yeah, it can vary a little bit. But the thing to think about is that every single thing that you do with that yarn has the potential to change the twist, unless you are always going from the side of something. So if you're going from the side of a cake of yarn, cake of yarn here, see this? If I was going off the side of this, then I wouldn't be gaining or losing any twist at this point. I would still be gaining or losing twist when I'm actually working with it. But if I took the yarn out of the center, or even around the outside, you see how it's going around, I'm going to be losing or gaining twist. Sometimes that's not going to matter. If you're working with a lace yarn that's got tons and tons of twist in every inch, it's probably not going to make that much difference. But if you're working with something that's a bit chunkier, you might find that you lose all of the twist as you're working with it. So it's just something to consider. Think about what's happening to the twist at every point that you're working with that yarn, or even just winding it into a ball, or you know, transferring it from one system to another. Andrew's saying I have that happen when ferrule knitting, but just with my right hand ball, throwing hand pulling from the outside of the ball. Yeah, it's really interesting when you start to notice it. You start to go, huh, this is interesting, because it only happens when I do this. Yeah, I hope that's in some way useful, and that I haven't just made people completely paranoid about a twist. So we are rapidly approaching the end of the session, which has gone really quickly. So I hope that that was useful for people. Do we have any final questions?
Yeah, I was just trying to re-find one in the chat later earlier, but it was to do with what do you use as your setup for winding from one thing to another? And I think that's quite relevant with what you've just said as well.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to a finished skein, I put it onto a Swift, which takes the yarn off the side, and then it goes onto a ball winder, which is also working from the side. When it comes to rewinding on, oh, I think I saw this comment. It was about rewinding a bobbin of yarn. It depends on which wheel I've got in front of me, because some wheels can be made to rewind bobbins. Essentially, if you can set it up so that the drive band is driving the bobbin instead of the flyer, which you can't do on all wheels, but some you can actually just use that to rewind your bobbins, because you just bypass the orifice. You don't go through the orifice at all. You just get this even vaguely into shot. Yeah, you would just come off the side of the bobbin. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think
you
so.
Also use things like ball winders with a toilet paper tube. Actually kind of fits on some ball winders. So that's another way of doing it, or a weaving bobbin winder.
Cool, thank you. What did I just saw one? There's lots of thanks and really helpful, and people like going, whoa, I need to really think about twist now. As I do as well. Oh, someone asked, where did they find the video of the Plying Bracelet? Does it have a title that they can look for?
I will find it for you. Carry on and I'll do some.
I'll just keep checking what people have said. Hard to keep up with the chat sometimes. There's so many people. There's lots of lovely things being said. Is there a way to keep the twist when you finish the last of the singles?
Not really, but then by the time you've got a couple of inches into it, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Just pop the link in the chat for the
thank you.
Plying bracelets.
Does a cable plied yarn suit particular projects?
Yeah, really good for socks is a popular use for it. And I haven't tried it with cables, but I've heard a few people say that it's a good option for
Yeah.
cables pop as well.
From Anne, what relationship do you have between the number of twists per inch in singles with the final number of twists per inch in your balance plied yarn?
There is an equation. If I can remember it off the top of my head, it's something like the total number of twists per inch plus 1. No, total number of twists per inch divided by the number of plies plus 1.
Yeah.
In theory, equals the amount of ply twist. I'm not convinced that you can apply maths to everything about spinning.
Yeah.
Especially hand spinning.
Yeah.
I think Laura's like, well, I disagree because you do all the maths. But yeah, there's a certain degree of variation in hand spinning. And I don't know that it's that simple when you've got different types of fibers involved. So I'm really interested in the figures and I keep a record of everything. But I don't necessarily plan things according to X amount of, twist per inch or whatever.
Yeah. Well, in the mill, if I'm planning a certain TPI for a single, yeah, and John's not taught me, there isn't a specific way to do it, and I'm sort of learning a lot about a twist on the machines that, yes, the twist in the ply is half and plus a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that and a bit.
Yeah.
Crucial.
And then yeah, the girls upstairs will look at the plied yarn and go, oh, actually it needs a bit more, needs a bit less. So it's something we sort of have to figure out with our own yarn as well on machines as well as for hand spinners.
Yeah, definitely. And there's all kinds of factors like you were talking about, humidity affects it as well. So, there's just so many variables. I'm not sure you can boil it down to an equation.
Trying to capture all these messages. Lots of thank yous. Quick one. What is a crepe yarn?
So a crepe is where you've got a plied yarn, and again you add more ply twist to it, and then you ply it with a single.
Yes, yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, everyone, for all your comments and questions. And go check out Becks's YouTube. Is it at Tiny Fibre Studio? Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. tinyfibrestudio.com is my website, so that'll get you there. There'll be links there as well.
Lovely, thank you. Because she just does amazing videos about all sorts of spinning things, and we have people come up to Becks and go, oh, I want to meet you in person. You've helped me so much with my spinning.
Yeah, honestly, that's the reason. It's just if it can be helpful to people, then that's great. That's why I do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think there'll be people going straight to their spinning wheels now and looking at their singles and looking at their plies and going, right, I'm going to do this and think about everything you've told us. Thanks so much, Becks. And
amazing.
to everyone coming. And the next session is at 2:30 and it is the colour work with Alex. So
Alex, yeah, I will see you there.
Yay. Thanks very much, everyone. See you soon. Bye.